People often believe that destiny follows well-laid plans, such as fences around a property. The wind was blowing hard that September morning, kicking up clouds of dust that danced across the farmyard like restless ghosts. Mikey watched from the balcony of his house, a solid wooden construction that he himself had erected with his own hands over the years. His calloused fingers clutched a still steaming cup of coffee, but his thoughts were far away, focused on the letter he had sent 3 weeks ago to a marriage agency in San Francisco. The property stretched for miles in all directions, fields of golden wheat that swayed gently in the morning breeze. The cattle grazed quietly in the farthest pastures, small dark dots against the infinite horizon. It was a good land, fertile and generous, but also lonely. Very lonely for a man who was over 40 without ever having known the warmth of a family of his own. Mikey had built all of this with a future that included more than just himself. Every board nailed, every fence raised, every well dug carried the silent hope that one day he would share that vastness with someone special. The house had too many rooms for one person, a table too big for solitary meals, a portico too wide to contemplate alone, the sunsets that painted the sky red and gold. The distant sound of hooves against the hard ground caught his attention. A cloud of dust was approaching along the main road, still small on the horizon, but growing rapidly. Mikey felt her heart race. Would it be the agency's response? The woman he had chosen through letters and photographs finally arriving to meet his new life. He walked down the steps of the balcony with measured steps, adjusting his hat over his head and smoothing the clean shirt he had put on especially for the occasion. He had mentally rehearsed that moment hundreds of times during the past few weeks, imagining what it would be like to welcome his future wife, what words he would use, how he would make her feel welcome on his property. The dust gradually dissipated, revealing not the elegant carriage he had hoped for, but a young woman riding a panting horse, her clothes torn and soiled with dirt. She slid out of the saddle before the animal even came to a complete stop, staggering slightly before regaining her balance. Her dark hair was disheveled, a few strands stuck to her sweaty face, and there was something in her eyes that Mike recognized immediately, the gaze of someone who had run away from something terrible. She raised her face towards him, and for a moment they just stared at each other in silence. The wind continued to blow between them, carrying the smell of dust and sweat from the tired horse. Mikey noticed that her hands were shaking slightly, not from nervousness, but from something she couldn't quite define. Maybe it was compassion. Maybe it was the instinctive recognition that this woman needed help. The young woman took a faltering step towards him, and he could see her face better. She was beautiful, despite the dirt and tiredness, but there was also a hardness in her features that spoke of difficult experiences. His clothes, though torn, had been expensive at some point, made of fine fabrics that were now stained and frayed by the journey. Mike took a few steps toward him, moved by an impulse that came from somewhere deep in his chest. This was not the woman he expected. She was not the bride carefully chosen through formal correspondence. It was a stranger who had arrived at his estate under mysterious circumstances, carrying secrets he had not even imagined. Even so, he couldn't shake the feeling that perhaps fate had different plans than his own. Perhaps those well-drawn fences he envisioned for his life were about to be redrawn in a way he could never have foreseen. Her horse snorted loudly, lowering his head to look for some grass among the dry land. The sound echoed through the silent courtyard, breaking the spell of the moment and bringing Mikey back to reality. He needed to do something, say some word, offer some kind of help to this woman who had clearly gone through difficult times. But before she could open her mouth, she spoke, her voice hoarse but firm, cutting through the warm morning air, like a sharp blade through the silence that stretched between them, like an open field waiting to be cultivated. The young woman lifted her chin with a dignity that contrasted strangely with her untidy appearance. His words came out firm, despite the exhaustion visible in every line of his body. "Sir, I apologize for trespassing on your property in this way. My name is Sarah, and I need your help." She paused, running her tongue over her parched lips. "I'm running away from men who want to take me back to a place I should never have been." Mike felt something tighten in her chest. There was a quality to her voice that touched him deeply, a mixture of vulnerability and strength that awakened all his protective instincts. He took a few more steps towards her, keeping his hands visible to show that he posed no threat. "Can you tell me what kind of men these are?" he asked, his voice coming out softer than he intended. Sarah hesitated for a moment, her eyes scanning the horizon as if she expected to see knights appearing at any moment. When she looked at him again, there were tears held back in her eyes, but also a fierce determination that made Mikey admire her even more. "Men who believe that women can be bought and sold like cattle," she said, the words coming off as a painful confession. "I escaped an auction in Carson City 3 days ago. I got on the first horse I could find and rode non-stop." The revelation hit Mikey like a punch in the stomach. He had heard stories about these places, shady establishments where women were treated as merchandise. He never imagined that one day he would meet someone who had lived this terrible reality. "You're safe here," he said, and the words came out with a conviction that surprised him. "No one is going to take her back anywhere while she is in my land." Sarah studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to decipher whether she could trust him. Mikey realized that she was evaluating every detail of his expression, looking for signs of falsehood or bad intent. It was the look of someone who had learned the cruel way that not all men were trustworthy. "Why would you help me?" she asked finally. "You don't even know me. I could be a criminal, a liar. My presence here can bring problems for you." Mike took the question seriously. Why was he willing to risk himself for a stranger? Perhaps it was because he recognized in Sarah something that he himself had long since lost, the ability to dream of a better life. Or maybe it was simply because the right way to act sometimes didn't need complicated explanations. "Because it's the right thing to do," he replied simply. "It's because I believe everyone deserves a second chance." The wind changed direction at that moment, bringing the distant smell of rain. Dark clouds were beginning to form on the horizon, promising a storm that could arrive before nightfall. Mike looked up at the sky and then turned her attention to Sarah. "Let's go inside," he said, gesturing toward the house. "You need food, clean water, and a place to rest. Your horse also needs to be taken care of." Sarah nodded, but he noticed that she still maintained a defensive posture, ready to flee at the slightest sign of danger. Mikey understood that she would gain his trust, little by little, through actions, not words. As they walked toward the house, he couldn't help but think of the irony of the situation. He had spent weeks waiting for a bride chosen through letters, a woman who would come to him out of convenience and mutual need. Instead, fate had placed in her path a woman who was on the run from men who wanted to control her, someone who valued freedom above all else. The house looked different when they entered together. Rooms that had seemed too big for one person suddenly took on a new dimension. Sarah looked around curiously, noticing the details that revealed Mike's character. The carefully arranged books on the shelf, the clean tools hanging on the wall, the polished wooden table where he ate his solitary meals. "Do you live alone here?" she asked, and there was something in his voice that he couldn't fully identify. "Yes," Mike replied, feeling suddenly aware of how empty his life must seem to an outsider. "A long time ago." Sarah nodded, but said nothing more. She approached the window and looked at the lands that stretched to the horizon. Mike watched her profile against the morning light and felt something move in her chest, something she hadn't felt in years. Maybe it was just compassion for someone in difficulty, or maybe it was the beginning of something he didn't even dare to name yet. Whatever it was, she knew her life had changed the moment Sarah stepped off that tired horse in her yard. And deep in his heart, he began to suspect that perhaps this change was exactly what he had been waiting for, without knowing it. The following days brought a strange and comforting routine to Mike's farm. Sarah had agreed to stay until she regained the strength to continue her journey, though he realized that she no longer mentioned any specific destination. In the morning, she helped with household chores, with an efficiency that revealed previous experience in heavy work. His hands, though delicate, knew how to prepare bread, care for chickens, and even assist in the treatment of horses. Mikey watched his movements with growing admiration. There was a natural graciousness in the way she performed each task, as if she found peace in the simplicity of honest work. During the hottest hours of the day, when the sun made any activity in the field impossible, she would sit on the porch, with one of his books, reading in silence as the wind gently moved her dark hair. The transformation in her was visible day after day. The constant tension in his shoulders gradually diminished, replaced by a more relaxed posture. His gaze, always alert to possible threats, gave way to moments of serene contemplation, especially when he watched the sunset dye the wheat fields golden. Mikey began to notice details she had initially missed, how her eyes sparkled when she laughed at the mischievous behavior of foals in the pasture, or how her lips curled slightly when she discovered a wildflower growing between the rocks. On the third night, a violent storm swept through the region. The wind howled around the house, causing the wood to creak and the windows to shake in their frames. Mikey woke up to the sound of thunder and noticed a faint light coming from the kitchen. He quietly went downstairs and found Sarah sitting by the table, a cup of hot tea in her hands, looking out the window at the pouring rain. She turned when she noticed him on the doorstep. There was no fear in his eyes, just a deep melancholy that touched something in the center of his chest. Without a word, Micah walked over and sat down on the other side of the table. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, but loaded with a mutual understanding that did not need to be verbalized. Sarah pushed a second cup toward her, steam gently rising from the surface of the hot liquid. They drank in silence, listening to the storm outside, each lost in their own thoughts. Mikey wondered what she was thinking, if she missed somewhere, if she had family in some distant corner of the country, but he didn't ask any questions, respecting her right to silence. When the storm finally subsided, Sarah got up and walked to the window. Her hands rested on the sill, and she watched the raindrops running down the glass. Mike noticed that her shoulders were shaking slightly, not from cold, but from something much deeper. He approached slowly, stopping at a respectful distance. In the reflection of the glass, he could see her face, and he recognized there the expression of someone who was struggling with painful memories. Without thinking twice, he reached out and placed it gently on his shoulder. The touch had an immediate effect. Sarah turned to him, and for the first time since she had arrived at the farm, her defenses completely crumbled. Silent tears streamed down her cheeks, and she made no move to hide them. Mikey felt her heart break as she saw all the pain she'd been keeping. Instinctively, he opened his arms, offering the quiet comfort of his presence. Sarah hesitated only for a moment before letting herself be enveloped by him. She cried against her chest, years of suffering and humiliation finally finding a safe way out. Mikey held it carefully, as if it was something precious that could break if handled roughly. The storm outside began to calm down, but inside the house, something fundamental had changed. When Sarah finally pulled away, her eyes were red but lighter, as if a heavy shadow had been removed. She looked at Mikey with an expression of gratitude that went far beyond words. At that moment, he understood that it no longer mattered when or if the mail order bride would arrive. Sarah had found a place in his heart that he didn't even know was empty. And for the first time in years, Mikey began to believe that perhaps he wasn't destined to live alone for the rest of his life. Dawn brought clear skies and the fresh air that always followed the storms. When Mikey went downstairs to prepare breakfast, she found Sarah already in the kitchen, preparing pancakes with the skill of someone who knew the routine well. She smiled at him, a genuine smile that lit up the entire room, and he knew that something precious had been born between them during the stormy night. A week after the storm, life on the farm had found a rhythm that felt natural, as if Sarah had always belonged here. Mornings began with the crowing of roosters and the gentle clatter of their bare feet on the kitchen floor, brewing coffee while Mikey tended to the animals. She had taken over the care of the garden with a dedication that revealed not only skill, but also hope for the future. Every seed planted, every seedling carefully watered seemed to represent his growing confidence that he could build something lasting on that piece of land. Mikey watched these small changes with a mixture of joy and apprehension. Part of him feared that the tranquility would be temporary, that one day Sarah would wake up missing the world beyond the confines of her property. Another part, however, began to dream of the possibility that she would choose to stay not out of necessity, but of her own free will. The feeling of completeness she experienced when she saw her working in the garden or reading on the porch was something she had never imagined possible. For years he had built his life around loneliness, convincing himself that the constant companionship of another person would be a burden. Now he realized how wrong he had been. Sarah's presence did not diminish her freedom, but expanded it, giving new meaning to each routine activity. On Saturday afternoon, while repairing a storm-damaged fence, Mikey saw a cloud of dust approaching from the main road. Her heart raced, but not with the anticipation she used to feel. Now there was a note of concern in his anxiety. Sarah was indoors preparing preserves with tomatoes from the garden, quietly humming a melody he didn't recognize, but that had become the soundtrack of his days. The carriage that stopped in his courtyard was elegant, pulled by two well-groomed horses. From it descended a woman dressed in expensive travel clothes, her blonde hair neatly arranged under a hat decorated with blue ribbons. She was carrying a small leather suitcase and looked around with the expression of someone who was evaluating a property for practical purposes. Mikey immediately recognized who she was, even before she introduced herself. It was Margaret Thompson, the mail-order bride he had chosen through letters exchanged over the course of 2 months. In the photographs she had sent, she looked elegant and respectable, exactly the kind of woman he had imagined would be suitable for his organized and predictable life. Margaret approached with confident steps, extending a gloved hand towards her. Her blue eyes assessed him with an efficiency that he found slightly uncomfortable. It was evident that she had come with specific expectations and was checking to see if he matched the criteria set out in her letters. She talked about the trip, about her impressions of the region, about the plans she had made during the journey there. His voice was pleasant, polite, but there was a mechanical quality to it that contrasted sharply with the natural musicality he had learned to associate with Sarah. Margaret was exactly what he had asked for, a practical, efficient woman, fit to be the wife of a prosperous farmer. As she spoke, Make found herself thinking about what her life would be like with Margaret. Quiet meals at the table, conversations about practical matters such as harvests and finances, a partnership based on mutual convenience and cordial respect. There was nothing wrong with that perspective. It was exactly what he had been looking for when he decided to look for a wife through correspondence. The sound of the door of the house opening made them both turn around. Sarah appeared on the porch, drying her hands on an apron that was tied around her waist. She paused as she saw the visitor, an expression of surprise and something else, perhaps resignation, crossing her face. Mikey felt her chest tighten as she realized that she had immediately understood the situation. Margaret followed his gaze and frowned slightly at the sight of Sarah. There was an unasked question in her eyes, a curiosity about the presence of another woman on the property. Mikey realized that she needed to explain the situation, but finding the right words seemed impossible. Sarah walked down the porch steps with the same natural grace he had grown to admire, but there was something different about her posture. It was as if she was preparing to leave, as if Margaret's arrival was a reminder that her stay there had always been temporary. The silence that settled between the three of them was loaded with tension. Margaret looked from Mike to Sarah with an increasingly questioning expression. Sarah kept her eyes downcast, her hands still clutching her apron in a gesture that revealed her nervousness. Mikey felt torn between two completely different worlds, two possibilities for the future that could not coexist. Margaret was the first to break the silence, asking polite but direct questions about Sarah's identity. Mikey explained the circumstances of her arrival, omitting the most sordid details, but making it clear that Sarah was a temporary guest who had needed help. He realized, as he spoke, that his own words sounded empty even to him. The afternoon progressed in a strange and embarrassing way. Margaret inspected the house with practical eyes, making observations about possible improvements and changes that she felt were necessary. She talked about her plans for the property, her ideas for making the operation more efficient, her expectations for the wedding that they had both agreed upon through letters. Sarah remained quiet throughout the visit, busying herself with household chores that kept her close enough to hear the conversations, but far enough away not to seem nosy. Mikey watched her out of the corners of her eyes, noticing how she avoided his gaze, how her movements had lost the natural spontaneity he had learned to value. When Margaret suggested that they would spend the night in the city and return the next day to finalize the wedding arrangements, Mikey felt a mixture of relief and panic. Relief that the tension of the day would finally end, Panic because I knew that a decision would need to be made soon. After the carriage departed, taking Margaret back to town, the farm seemed eerily quiet. Sarah had disappeared, and Mike found her in the stable, brushing the horse she had ridden when she had arrived at the estate weeks earlier. The animal was in much better condition now, strong and rested, ready for a long journey. She didn't look up as he approached, focusing on the task, with an intensity that revealed she was using the work to avoid a difficult conversation. Mikey stood there, watching her work, feeling the weight of the unmade decisions pressing against her chest like a stone. The truth was crystal clear, even if he wasn't ready to admit it yet. Margaret represented security, predictability, the organized life he had built over the years. Sarah represented something much riskier, the possibility of a happiness he didn't even know he was looking for, but which now seemed essential, like the air he breathed. When Sarah finally finished tending to the horse, she turned to him with an expression of determination that made her heart race. There were tears held back in his eyes, but also a resolution that he recognized immediately. It was the same expression she had used when she arrived at the farm, that of someone who was ready to make difficult decisions to protect what she considered right. She walked up to him, stopped a few steps away, and for the first time in days, looked him straight in the eye. In that look, Micah saw everything she needed to know. Sarah had understood that he had a choice to make, and she was prepared to leave to make that choice easier for him. But seeing her determination, Micah finally understood what her choice really was. It wasn't between two different women, but between two completely different versions of himself. The version that he had written letters to a marriage agency, looking for a practical and convenient partner, and the version that had discovered what it meant to wake up each morning anxious to see the smile of someone special. The sunset painted the sky red and gold, the same colors he had observed alone for years. But now, looking at Sarah, Mikey knew she no longer wanted to gaze at these sunsets in solitude. He wanted to share them with the woman who had come to his property as a fugitive and became, without either of them realizing it, the most important person in his life. The choice, he realized, had been made long ago, by the time he saw Sarah get off that tired horse in his yard. All that was left now was to find enough courage to honor that choice. If you want to continue following exciting narratives about the American Wild West with remarkable characters and twists that touch the heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate notifications.